Armour of Contempt, Marine Power Armour got better, AP-1 got much worse, but has it been a good thing for the game overall? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Armour of Contempt, the Games Workshop balance pass that made quite a lot of tough units a little bit tougher in 40k, but has been perhaps treated by a bit of an eye roll for all the factions not affected. It's been a good few months now since this balance patch was introduced, but has it been a good thing or a bad thing for Warhammer 40k? So I'm sure most of you watching will probably be well aware what Armour of Contempt is. It's basically a boost to Space Marine Power Armour and a few other things, and it was implemented in a balanced data slate about 5 months ago. The meta was at a point then when just about everything in Power Armour was kind of underwhelming, so it was a bit of an attempt to make Space Marines a bit more survivable and generally stronger as a whole. At first, the balance patch basically applies to basically all Space Marines plus Sisters of Battle, and it's included Chaos Marines, Death Guard, Thousand Sons, and also the Grey Knights. Now, as of recent releases, it also seems to apply to Guard vehicles as well, so Leman Russ battle tanks getting a bit tougher, and also with the new Leagues of Votan out, they have their Void Armour, which is basically Armour of Contempt plus turning off some rerolls. The way the rule works is basically a bolt-on balance patch add-on. You worsen the AP by -1 whenever you attack certain units that have it, and it basically means that things in Power Armour aren't going to care too much about being shot by higher AP things, or at least not as much as they did before. It's a very good defensive buff, though it didn't get applied to literally everything. Grey Knight Dread Knights don't get it, you don't have it if you have a Storm Shield or the equivalent, and it doesn't apply if you've got any other rules in the Codex that act in the exact same way. In general, the higher the armor save, the more impact it has, so certainly things like Terminators, or particularly Terminators when they're getting light cover, you can have absolutely obscenely high saves against high AP weapons, and it can make them a lot more survivable. I feel like perhaps one of the main reasons that Armour of Contempt was introduced was that throughout 8th and 9th edition, higher and higher AP weapons have been happening throughout the game, including say quite a lot of basic small arms getting AP -1, and it did basically add up to Space Marine armor saves being a little bit on the meaningless side. Any Space Marine unit that had its standard armor save but no invul save was arguably at a disadvantage, with lots of people running things like Storm Shields. I think there might have been at least a little bit of a nod to lore purposes as well, as generally there was a sentiment that people wanted Terminator armor and big stompy armored things to feel a bit tougher, and certainly with the 2+ armor saves, it's been a bit of a nice buff to anything in tactical dreadnought armor. I feel like while it's actually quite a simple rule change, I think people do look at it in really quite different ways. You can either look at it from a game balance perspective, whether it's made 40k armies a bit more balanced as a whole. You can also look at it from a game design type perspective. Is it a good thing to have as a mechanic in 9th edition 40k, and does it justify the additional bloat to the rules? And I think you can also look at it from a lore on the tabletop type vibe. In general, with Games Workshop's rules, I think they typically try and make the things that are in the lore happen on the tabletop as best as they can, and that's something that they do try and do alongside the game balance. First up though, if we are talking about game balance, I do think that Armour of Contempt has generally been a largely positive thing. It was a rules boost to a lot of armies that were kind of struggling, and it actually worked quite neatly in targeting a lot of the factions that weren't doing well at the moment and giving them a solid and meaningful rules boost by extra toughness. On top of that, I think it maybe did a bit of levelling of the playing field within units within the faction. As I said, quite a lot of things that didn't have invul saves were being overlooked, say for example Space Marine Centurions or Aggressors. By making the armor save a bit more meaningful and arguably the invul save a bit less so, it has actually meant that a fair few more people have been playing those kind of units. Currently, taking stock of the Armour of Contempt factions, I think it's hard to argue that it's really too much of a problem. Guard on the whole still remain pretty weak despite having very tough Rosses now. Marines in general are still on the weaker side, maybe just a couple of armies punching up a bit like Blood Angels and Dark Angels. Grey Knights, Thousand Sons and Death Guard I'd rank all around about mid-tier for 40k. Certainly not bad armies, but not particularly stand out either. Perhaps out of the Armour of Contempt armies, unless you're counting Leagues of Votan, Sisters of Battle are really the only ones that are doing massively well. Armour of Contempt will be part of the reason for that, but I think perhaps more than that it might be some useful points drops in Nephilim, things like Zephyrim going down, and also access to some very easy secondaries. Overall, I'd say that at least for in-faction game balance for 40k, it's generally been a positive thing. Without Armour of Contempt, some of the weakest factions in the game would be even weaker, and a lot of the mid-tier ones will be probably more towards the weaker tier of things, with Grey Knights, Thousand Sons, Death Guard and Chaos Marines. At the very least, I'd argue it's not really causing problems from a game balance perspective. On the other hand though, I think it is a bit more of a debate as to whether or not it's a good thing for game design, and whether or not it really adds much to 40k, rather than being sort of more bloat and rules for the sake of rules. I think there are positives and negatives, and here are perhaps a few of the positives. First up, Armour of Contempt effectively stretches the AP system a bit, and effectively allows a higher tier of armour to exist, over and above the standard 2+ to 6+ armour saves. Every so often you do hear people talking about 40k being a bit limited because it's locked to the D6 system, and it does mean that there's only so much scope for granularity. Your armour save has got to be one of those 5 different saving throws, and arguably Armour of Contempt can mean that you can have a 2+ save with a +1 onto it effectively. So it could be good to represent higher armour that's only ever going to be penetrated by very high AP. I guess in effect it can still allow some very high APs to go around, and still have some units that have armour that's good enough to overcome them. Otherwise, I do kind of like the way that it's made light cover a bit more relevant. Certainly Space Marines already like to get light cover whenever they can. A +1 to your save is even nicer when you're worsening the AP by -1. Generally things that reward board positioning are usually good things for game design, I feel. And as well as light cover, it makes the entire AP system a bit more relevant. Again, it's a bit less of a case of whether you have an invul or you die. It means that things with invul saves are just a little bit less important to have, as with Armour of Contempt you might never reach that invul save. For example, a standard Dreadnought compared with a Contemptor Dreadnought, if you hit them with a las cannon, then usually the Contemptor would have got an advantage with the 5+ save, where the standard Dreadnought only had a 6+, but in Armour of Contempt they both have the 5+ regardless. Invul saves are now only more relevant against very high AP things like melter guns. In addition, it actually means that very high AP shots do actually have a bit more of a point as well. Earlier in 8th and 9th edition it was kind of pointless to be having AP -4 or AP 5 weapons, but now with Terminators and cover going around, those weapons could actually be very useful to actually force them onto bad saves. Finally, along with all that, it does make AP -1 and AP -2 weapons a little bit less universally great. For quite a lot of armies throughout 8th and 9th edition, if you could just spam tons of AP -1 or AP -2 shots, you'd generally have enough damage go through. Now Armour of Contempt introduces a fairly common hard counter to AP -1 weapons, and it hits AP -2 more than most. Most of those weapons will be super efficient against armies without Armour of Contempt, but if you are playing Space Marines or the like, then they're not going to be quite as valuable. As for downsides from game design, I think maybe a few people are a little bit weary of quite so many band-aid patches being stitched onto the edition. 8th edition started out kind of simple, and as more codexes and game-wide special rules have come out, it has certainly started to creak a bit under the weight of all the add-ons to the game that it's received. Layers and layers of things are built up as Games Workshop keeps on tweaking their game. I guess you could argue that you might be able to facilitate very high saving throws just through the standard AP system. Say maybe give some units an effective 1+ save that still has the normal rule of 1s always fail. The other alternative would just be to try and stick to those values and be a bit more limited with how much AP you give factions, so you're a bit less likely to push everything onto an invul save. Another criticism that I've seen is it makes AP -1 weapons just very matchup dependent and kind of annoying for the factions that have lots of them. I think maybe one good example of that is Orcs maybe. Boys with choppers are generally at least fairly efficient against most infantry targets, but if you're playing any Armour of Contempt armies then they get significantly less so. I guess it's a bit strange just having a whole bunch of units that get massively less efficient if they're playing power armour, but they're quite good if they're not. Though I guess at least from a game design point of view it might not be the worst thing in the world. You might be taking more or less of them depending on how many Marines are in the meta. Finally, as well as fixes, I think it does also create a few problems for Games Workshop. Say for example when Armour of Contempt came out they had to change a whole bunch of sub-faction special rules. They had to change a bunch of things like Iron Warriors, Valorous Heart and Salamanders, all to being no wound rerolls against them rather than ignoring AP -1. Perhaps a bit of a strange side grade for the faction. There are also a few rules that just really don't make too much sense in some of the codexes as well. Say for example a Black Legion relic in Codex Chaos Space Marines that effectively does nothing with Armour of Contempt, even though admittedly it still has a very useful second ability to go teleporting. Perhaps that's just one negative of having such a broad and all-encompassing special rule. Finally, and perhaps equally importantly for the feel of 40k on the tabletop, is whether or not the Armour of Contempt rule feels right. I must admit, when you're putting Space Marine power armoured units on the board, the extra durability really does make you feel that power armour in game a bit more, and it's kind of nice to see big stompy Terminators and Centurions and things get genuinely tough again. Meanwhile though, I think at least a fair few units from other factions are pretty jealous of the rule, in particular the Adeptus Custodes, who are basically Space Marines but better. Their army didn't receive the buff, I think literally just because Games Workshop thought it would have made them too powerful. Currently they're a bit of a middling faction in 40k, and perhaps they didn't want to just set them right back to being one of the top dogs again. It does feel kind of weird for them to be left out though, particularly as it could allow, say, some factions' Terminators being significantly tougher than Custodians against certain firepower, as a fair bit of the time that extra +1 to your save is going to be more useful compared with an extra bit of toughness or an extra wound. I feel like perhaps it might be a bit of a flavour win to let Custodians have the rule, and then maybe just increase the points on the models a little bit if Games Workshop really thinks that they need it. It does also maybe feel a little bit on the unusual side that guard vehicles get Armour of Contempt, but say Imperial and Chaos Knights don't, and nor do AdMech vehicles. Again, I don't think that there's really any lore justification for that. I think just literally they were trying to give guards some nice buffs as they're one of the factions that's struggling the most, and they thought that that could be a nice way to increase their vehicle's survivability. I think you could probably make the same sort of argument for a lot of other big, tough, or well-armoured things in the game as well. Say for example maybe Orc Meganobs or the Necron Monolith. I think you could certainly argue that they could get it too. But if you get to the point of farming out Armour of Contempt to the vast majority of factions, the rule might just be a bit on the redundant side, and maybe you might as well have not bothered in the first place. So anyway, I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts. Is Armour of Contempt a good thing for Warhammer 40k? And let me know why it is or isn't from a game balance, lore, or game design perspective. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.